how do fresh moves of God begin? How do fresh moves of God start or begin? So what I wanted to do was to look at some principles that seem to me, both from biblical data, but also looking through church history, look at some ingredients that seem to always be present whenever God starts to move in a fresh way. So I'm going to try and root it in Ezekiel 47. So I'll just read the first 12 verses, and then I'm just going to illustrate the principles through Ezekiel's experience, because he saw a fresh move of God in this chapter, in his context. And although situations, cultures, generations differ, I think the same things that he experienced are common when God begins to move in a fresh way in any particular generation or nation or people group. So let me just read the first 12 verses. This is Ezekiel speaking about the Lord. He said, "Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. And then he brought me out by way of the north gate and led me around on the outside to the outer gate that faces toward the east. And behold, the water was trickling out on the south side. Going on eastward with a measuring line in his hand, the man measured 1,000 cubits. And then he led me through the waters, and it was ankle deep. Again, he measured 1,000 and led me through the water, and it was knee deep. Again, he measured 1,000 and led me through the water, and it was waist deep. Again, he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass through, for the water had risen. It was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be passed through. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? Then he led me back to the bank of the river. And as I went back, I saw on the bank of the river very many trees on one side and on the other. And he said to me, this water flows towards the eastern region and goes down into the Araba and enters the sea. When the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh. And wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live, and there will be very many fish. For this water goes there, that the waters of the sea may become fresh. So everything will live where the river goes. Fishermen will stand beside the sea from En-gedi to En-gleim, and it will be a place for the spreading of nets. Its fish will be of very many kinds, like the fish of the great sea. But its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They are to be left for salt. And on the banks of both sides of the river there will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. But they will bear fresh fruit every month, because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing." So the first thing to say in verse 1, first thing to notice, is it's very personal. God starts with a person, or sometimes with a very few people. He doesn't start with a crowd. He always starts with one person or with a few people. So when we think about people like Gideon, God met with him on his own. It was a bit of a surprise to Gideon, but God started with the individual. Or Abraham, God called to Abraham, gave him promises, told him he would be the father of many nations. He started a move of God through Abraham, started a move of God through Gideon. Nehemiah, facing the ruin of Jerusalem and the rubble of all the broken down walls, God got hold of him, and Gideon and Nehemiah felt great lament and grief and yearning for God to move, and God began to speak to him and work in his heart. And here Ezekiel is exactly the same. It says, then he brought me back to the door of the temple. It's almost like a return to proximity with God. There was a closeness of Ezekiel and God coming together. He brought him to the door of the temple. I mean, the temple was where God's presence resided. So to bring him back to the door of the temple means to bring him into proximity with the presence of God for personal dealings, personal encounter, personal engagement with God, that he might be transformed himself, and that would then lead to a move of God. We see the same thing with Moses. In fact, wherever you look through the Bible, that is the way God does it, whether it's the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus, whether it's Peter and the dealings that Jesus had with him, preparing him and saying, you know, on this rock I'll build my church. He's saying to Peter, look, I've met with you. Satan's desired to sift you like wheat, but I've prayed for you, Peter, that your faith may not fail. God always deals with individuals, with men or women who he brings close to him. There's a kind of a mustard seed principle in that, isn't there? Because you think, well, one person can feel very small when we look at the need around us, and perhaps whatever nation you're in or whatever situation you're in, probably like myself, you think, goodness, the need all around me seems so vast. I'm just one person, what difference can I make? But God always begins with a mustard seed. It's a kingdom principle. He always begins with one person or a few people, the mustard seed planted in the ground that seems insignificant, or the little bit of yeast in the batch, that somehow then miraculously the kingdom does its work. And something that seems so small and insignificant, you know, what good can come from Nazareth, or a baby in a manger in Bethlehem? How can that change the world? That's how God works. He always does that. So what I wanted to do is to just give you 2 or 3 little accounts of people and their stories. So I'm going to ask Andrea to play a video. Now, Terry Virgo is a bit of a spiritual father to me in Newfrontiers, and in this little clip, he's just going to tell the story of a guy called Dennis Clark, and how back in the sort of 70s, 80s, God began to do something that then became a real move of God across the world. And I want you just to follow the little stages. It doesn't so much matter about the events that took place, although they're interesting. I just want you to think about what I've said in terms of the biblical process, and how God begins with one person in a very insignificant little way, and how it begins to grow. And then I'll read you a couple of accounts of other people who God used at different generations. So Andrea, if we can try and run that video now, I think that'll be the right time for that.
Today I want to tell you about 3 guys who had a terrific impact on me. Phil Vogel introduced me to Dennis Clark, a South African who lived in Worthing, full of the Holy Spirit, full of faith. He was an evangelist, actually, with Youth for Christ. And he, one year, decided over the time of the new year to set aside time just to pray. He said to his wife, I'm going to pray and study my Bible for 2 or 3 days. Had such a happy time that next year he said, I'm going to invite some friends. And some friends came to his home, and he preached to them, they prayed together. And then the next year he invited some more people. I got caught up in that next year, and Phil and I were there in his home. There would have been perhaps something like 30 people packed into his lounge. And he preached, a terrific preacher. And it was preaching and then praying. I mean, not just full prayer time. So wonderful days of inspiring preaching and terrific praying. And then one year he said, next year we're going to be joined by my friends Campbell McAlpine and Arthur Wallace, who are both in New Zealand at the moment, but they will be with us next year. They came the following year. It was wonderful. I mean, it was just so exciting. For me, several years, almost a decade, every year began and ended at Dennis's prayer and Bible weeks. They were fabulous. And one year, a guy called Fred Pride, who had responsibility for what was called the Abinger Convention, got filled with the Holy Spirit. And he said, I want to change the Abinger Convention. Well, by that time, Dennis's things had outgrown his home and moved to Capel. And about 100 people were coming to the New Year event of prayer and fasting. And this guy came and said, I want to change my Abinger Convention in the summer. And so he invited Dennis, Arthur, Campbell, and Jean Darnell. to speak in a big tent at Capel in their grounds, the beautiful grounds there, and invited people to camp. And they started the Capel Bible Week. It all went back to Dennis Clark alone, and then with 30, then with 100, and then this summer camp. He said, well, I can't make it prayer as well. We're in a tent. So it became a Bible Week. And it went for 7 years. It was terrific. And it was ever so formative because the preaching was dramatic. It was on the back of the growing charismatic movement. And to be honest, the guys who organized it, all they had in common was that they were filled with the Holy Spirit. And behind the scenes, there was growing tension because the preachers were preaching a bigger and bigger message. People like Ern Baxter came over from the USA. Bryn Jones preached. Worship was led by people like Gerald Coates and Barney Coombs. The worship was great. It was like the first Bible Week. It set the pattern. And hundreds came. Actually, you know, only 750 people ever camped there. Seems tiny now. But on the last year, it ran for 7 years. On the last year, Ern Baxter was the preacher. It's a beautiful summer. They held it in June in the long evenings. And I remember that year, it was so hot and the sides of the tent were put up and people were pouring in the evenings. So there were 2,000 people at that last year in the evenings to hear Ern Baxter preaching extraordinary, powerful stuff. And, you know, out from that came the Dales Bible Week. And out from that came, well, the Downs Bible Week and then Stoneleigh. It's an interesting journey. And at the center of it was actually Dennis, Campbell, and Arthur. Arthur Wallace then went on to become, to be honest, a dear friend. And he was looking for a restored church. He had the passion for the church. And his preaching and teaching stimulated me to think much more about the church, not just the charismatic, but God wanting a church, a radical. He wrote a book called The Radical Christian. He was a fine man, a godly preacher. And these three guys, Campbell was a wonderful preacher, Dennis, these three guys were superb in pushing things along, inspiring, motivating, leading the way. They had a huge impact on me. I'm so grateful for their friendship. Arthur got closer to me, and in the end, he urged me, you must write a book. The things you're saying, you must write a book. Out of that, I wrote Restoration in the Church. Well, he was the one who pushed me to do that.
Okay, so as I say, the actual details and what emerged are secondary. What I want us to notice just from that, from Terry's story, is that it began with one man just saying to his wife, oh, I'm just going to spend 2 or 3 days reading my Bible and praying. It began from that. And in the end, thousands upon thousands of people across the world have been influenced by that move, by that movement. And so it's interesting to see how God begins sometimes with just one person who feels just a sense of God bringing them back, just like Ezekiel, bringing them back to the door of the temple, bringing them back to spend time with God, with no agenda, just a sense of needing to be near God, needing to be with God and to see what God would do. Just to give another example, back some years now, let me just find this. Speaking about a man in the UK called William Wilberforce, around the turn of the 1800s. And it says about him in a book around him. Well, it says William Wilberforce was a dissolute young MP, Member of Parliament, who came spiritually to life in the Great Awakening. He had brilliant powers of speech and was a friend of the highly talented William Pitt, who became Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1801 at the age of 24. And it says this, Wilberforce's spiritual direction changed after a reading holiday abroad, during which he had lengthy conversations with his former tutor, Dr. Isaac Milner. Wilberforce became thoroughly convinced of the call of God on his life. He went off to John Newton by night to seek his advice about how he should respond to his change of heart. And Newton persuaded him to remain a politician and use his talents in Parliament. And it says, So you got God dealing with an individual just when he's on a reading holiday. Just brought me back to the temple, as it were, just him and God, just God dealing with him when he's on his own, speaking to him. Then it goes on to say, Wilberforce became involved with others in many other causes, working as part of a group called the Clapham Sect. This exceptional group were intelligent, influential, and mainly Anglican campaigners. It all began when Wilberforce and his cousin, Henry Thornton, moved as bachelors to a house in Clapham in 1782. The two men later married and settled in separate houses, and other friends came to live nearby too, and their families spent much time in each other's homes. In addition to those already related, a number of marriages took place between these like-minded households. So here you have one man having an encounter with God, then he finds a friend who feels a similar sense of connection, stirring to a vision. So they move nearby to one another in a place, they get married to their wives, and then other friends move in, and this sort of Clapham sect, this group of friends, begin to do extraordinary reform through politics and through social change within the United Kingdom. But it began with a reading holiday. And then the last example is from a revival, actually in my hometown. I live in a place called Lowestoft, which is on the east coast of the UK. And it was actually the last place in mainland UK to see revival in 1921. There were obviously revivals after that in the Hebrides and other places, but in the mainland, the Lowestoft revival was the last one. And the revival was very much started by God using a man called Douglas Brown, who lived in London and had a very successful church. And I'll just read you a little bit of the story of how God began to meet with him, because you'll get the same principles just echoed again. He said, God laid hold of me in the middle of a Sunday evening service, and he nearly broke my heart while I was preaching. I went back to my vestry and locked the door and threw myself down on the rug in front of the fire, broken-hearted. Why, I do not know. My church was full of people. I loved my people, and I believe my people loved me. I do not say they ought to have done, but they did. And I was as happy there as I could be. I'd never known a Sunday there for 15 years without somebody being converted. That night I went home and went straight up to my study, and my wife came to tell me that supper was ready. And I said to her, you mustn't wait for me. What's the matter? She said. I've got a broken heart, was my reply. It was worthwhile having a broken heart for Jesus to mend it. I had no supper that night. Christ had laid his hand on a proud minister and told him that he'd not gone far enough, and there were reservations in his surrender. And he wanted him to do a piece of work that he'd been trying to evade. I knew what he meant. All November, that struggle went on, but I would not give way. I knew God was right, and I knew I was wrong. I knew what it would mean for me, and I was not prepared to pay the price. Then Christmas time came, and all the joy around me seemed to mock me. I knew what Jesus wanted. He showed me pictures of my congregation and Douglas Brown on his knees in the middle of them. I saw Douglas Brown praying for his people, to whom he'd preached for over 15 years. I saw it all in the picture. But yet the struggle went on, and I said to the Lord, you know, this is not my work. I will pray for anyone else who does it, but please don't give it to me. It will kill me. I cannot get into the pulpit and plead with people. It's against my temperament, and you made me. All through January, God wrestled with me. There is a love that will not let us go. Glory be to God. And at the end of January, I was still like poor Jacob, struggling instead of clinging. I thought that what was wrong was my circumstances, when really what was wrong was Douglas Brown. We always put it down to our circumstances as long as we can. And it was in February 1921, after 4 months of struggle, that there came the crisis. Oh, how patient God is. And on the Saturday night, I wrote out my resignation to my church, and it was marked with my own tears. I loved the church, but I felt that if I could not be holy, I would at least be honest. And I felt that I could not go on preaching while I had a contention with God. That night, the resignation lay on my desk, and I went to bed, but not to sleep. And as I went out of my bedroom door in the early hours of the morning, I tripped over my dog. If ever I thanked God for my dog, I did that night. And as I knelt at my study table, the dog licked my face. And I felt that I did not deserve anybody to love me. I felt an outcast. Then something happened. I found myself in the loving embrace of Christ forever and ever, and all the power and joy and blessedness rolled in upon me like a deluge. How did it come? I can't tell you. Perhaps I may when I get to heaven, as all explanations are there, but the experience was here. That was at 2 o'clock in the morning. God had waited for 4 months for a man like me, and I said, Lord Jesus, I know what you want. You want me to go into mission work, and I love you more than I dislike that. I did not hear any rustling of angels' wings, and I did not see any sudden light. What happened was he did then resign from his church, and the next month he was invited to come to Lowestoft to preach. And when he came up for that weekend, revival broke out, which then continued for a number of years and spread to lots of different places. But it all started, to use the image of Ezekiel, when God brought him back. It was a personal encounter. It was a personal dealings. He wrestled with God because he was leading a church and loving it, but he knew that God was calling him to go out on mission, traveling, itinerant. He didn't want to do it at first. So there was this, in his case, there was a wrestling going on. So all of those circumstances are different, but the common factor, and I would say the common factor whenever God begins to move afresh, is he will always deal with a man or a woman. He'll bring us back to the door of the temple. He'll bring us into some kind of proximity with himself, some kind of nearness to himself, for him to speak to us, give us vision, give us calling, give us direction, give us a sense of what he wants us to do, give us an opportunity just to consecrate and surrender ourselves to him afresh. He will do that. Now, the second thing we see in Ezekiel's journey is in verse 2. It says, then he brought me out by way of the north gate and led me out to the outside, to the outer gate that faces toward the east. And behold, the water was trickling out on the south side. I want to notice that when God begins to move, very often, and we see it in the Bible, we see it in many places, there's a trickling first. God's move begins to trickle. I mean, there are exceptions, such as the day of Pentecost. Well, there's this massive deluge. But very often, there's this small start. Maybe not much to shout about, not much to show for it, actually quite insignificant, a little trickle of water. But the point was, something had started that God had initiated. And Ezekiel was right there when this little small beginnings, and doesn't the Bible say, do not despise the day of small things? Sometimes we can expect a big arrival, when actually what happens is a small beginning. Just a trickle of water. And then you find that in verses 3 to 5, that trickle begins to get amplified, begins to deepen, get wider. So it says, the man measured 1,000 cubits and led me through water that was ankle deep. So it's gone from a trickle to ankle deep. And then he measured again. It was knee deep, waist deep, and then a river that I couldn't pass through deep enough to swim in. So there is a kind of an exponential process going on here from the days of small things, and perhaps many of you are involved in things and you sense that the Lord is with you. You sense that you're responding to his call. You're perhaps involved in something and there's the beginnings of something. But it can feel like very small beginnings, very, very small thing compared to what's needed. But that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't God, and that it isn't the way he's wanting to work. We can sometimes be a bit impatient. And then in verse 6, he says to Ezekiel, when this process has gone on, he said to him, "Son of man, have you seen this?" That's a strange question, considering he's written it all down and he's saying he's struggling to swim in it. Of course he's seen it. He's been right in the middle of it. So God isn't asking him, "Have you seen it with your eyes?" He's asking him, "Do you understand this? Do you get this? Are you getting what's happening here?" And what God is doing, I think, is saying to Ezekiel, have you understand the process? Have you understand the principles? Do you see how I'm beginning to move? Are you aware of God's activity and the way God is moving? And that can be really important for us, just to be attentive. And we can often miss things. We can often think, oh, we miss what God is doing. God sometimes is quite hidden in what he does until it breaks forth. So that's why he asked him the question, have you seen this? And I want you to notice that there was a constant flow that just got ever deeper. And it began with God, and it was deepened by God, and it was extended by God. And it sort of speaks to us about the fact that God actually is in control of the pace of his activity and the breadth of his activity. And Ezekiel really is responding to what God is doing. He's not trying to initiate anything that God is doing. So when the river gets wider and deeper, you'll notice that all of the things Ezekiel then goes on to comment on are observations he's making. He didn't say, right, let's build some canals, let's get some banks sorted out, let's import some fish, let's make sure the channels. He's not the one digging things in order for God to fill it. He's observing what God is doing, and then he is responding to the move of God. And I think that, again, is a principle we can learn. We can sometimes expect God to do things in a way that we're familiar with, or a bit like Peter on the Mount of Transfiguration. God's beginning to move in an unusual way. And Peter says, well, let's build three booths so that we can all sit here and, solidify it. That wasn't what God wanted. God was initiating it, and God did it in his way, and it finished in his way because it had a bigger purpose. So we need to be careful we don't try to organize God. Just let him do what he wants to do, and respond to what he does when we see him moving. Then the next thing, just looking at these verses from 7 to 12, we can see what I would call multiplied fruitfulness. It says, as I went back, I saw on the bank of the river very many trees on one side and the other. And he said, this water flows toward the eastern region and goes into the Araba and enters the sea. When the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh. And wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live. And there will be very many fish. For this water goes there, and that the waters of the sea may become fresh. So everything will live where the river goes. Fishermen will stand beside the sea, place for spreading of nets. Its fish will be of many kinds. So the picture there, if you can just imagine the scene, is these rows of trees, fruit-bearing, waters filled with all kinds of fish and fishermen fishing for it. Ezekiel has had nothing whatsoever to do with any of that happening. He's just been faithful with what God has asked him to do, which was to come back to the temple, meet with the presence of God, and journey through the things that God took him through in terms of the waters, being deeper and deeper. And what this speaks to me about is multiplied fruitfulness. In other words, trees and rivers bearing fruit way beyond one person's capacity. So that you look at it, you think, well, how did this happen? Who made this happen? And whenever God starts to move in a fresh way, it should always make us think there's no way any of us could have made this happen. This is way beyond any one person's capacity. So when Ezekiel looked at it, he thought, well, I didn't plant those trees. I didn't bring these fish here. I haven't created any of it. I'm just observing. I'm watching what God is doing, and I'm seeing this multiplied fruitfulness. And that is an encouragement to us that all God requires of us when he starts to move, all he requires of us is that we are obedient to what he asks us to do. And obedience in the kingdom always leads to fruitfulness, and fruitfulness will go way beyond what we might consider productivity. Productivity is what happens when we do put effort in for things. Whereas fruitfulness is when we do something obediently for God, and something beyond our ability comes as a result of it. God blesses obedience. He blesses those who listen to him, encounter him, wait upon him, and then obediently do what he's asking them to do. That's where fruitfulness comes from, not from techniques or structures or ideas that we might have. And then there's an interesting verse in here that I think is relevant to the COVID season that we've all been living through. In verse 8, it says, sorry, not verse 8, verse 11. It says, but its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They are to be left for salt. When you first read that, verse 11, you almost think, well, that's a bit of a waste of a verse. Why do we even need to know about that? This is wasted land. It's not productive. There's nothing in it. Why did he even comment on it? Just talk about all the lovely trees and the fish. But there's a verse that particularly draws attention to the marshlands and the swamps that haven't become fresh. They're just left for salt. And I don't know perhaps how you feel about the past year or so that we've been living through, but to me it feels like a bit of a swamp and a marsh to me. Most of us haven't been able to do the things we had planned. We can't see any fruitfulness. Most of us are very, very worn out by the whole process, and it just looks like a salty marsh with no trees, no fish, nothing. It looks like a complete waste of time. It looks like, what on earth has come from this that can be glorifying to God? But I want you to notice that it is that verse indicates that there is a purpose, even in an area of land that looks unfruitful, because salt came from it, which was needed for fertilizer to make things grow well. It was needed to encourage growth. And if you hadn't have had that salt marsh, then the soil would have been undernourished. And that speaks to me about the fact that sometimes when we are longing for God to move, and then we hit something like last year, and it just looks like everything's just in a bit of a muddle and a mess, and we've all gone backwards. Even those bits of life, those verses, those verse 11 moments, are not wasted with God. They're actually all part of his providential dealings with us, and they get included in Scripture, and they get included in our lives, and our lives are the richer for them. Our lives are nourished, and there will be something even now, I believe, that will come from the COVID season that somehow will be used to enrich and feed and nurture the soil of God's purposes, so that it's not wasted time, it's not wasted land. It's something that God somehow will be able to get hold of, even in our most desperate moments when we look at it and think, this is just a salty swamp. What a waste. What a waste of land, what a waste of time. No, there's something God will bring out of it that will then nourish the land around it. It will nourish our lives in some way and nourish his purpose. So even in Ezekiel's day, what seemed like waste was actually purposeful. And you often find that in moves of God when you read stories biographies of men and women of God who've done extraordinary things for God, you'll often find very fallow periods, difficult years, setbacks, things that cost dearly, and things that are just full of mystery. I think, why did that happen? God's called me to do this, but now this has happened. It seems to be the opposite of what God's called me to do. It's stopping me from doing what God's called me to do. There are mysteries in life that do come, and that's not uncommon. That seems to be one of these mysteries of providence that we have to navigate. But it doesn't mean that we've taken a wrong turn. It doesn't mean God has left us. It's simply part of his providence for these things to happen. So you find then, just as we bring it into land, that there's fish of all kinds. Everything thrives. Everything thrives. And whenever God moves by his Spirit, you will find not only do people come to Christ, but it'll have an impact in society. It'll change the atmosphere even of the whole place we're in. It will have far-reaching effects, far more than what we thought were possible.